when we forget history, history repeats itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that history in Oklahoma was absolutely buried, forgotten history.
Welcome to our latest episode of Book Reporter Talks To, where our guest today is Lisa Wingate, and we are going to be talking about her latest historical novel, Shelterwood, which I'm crazy about. It's a Book Reporter Bets On selection. I finished reading this, and I wanted to go do more research. I want to know more about the story because she did such a good job of bringing me right into it. You probably remember Lisa from her #1 New York Times bestseller, Before We Were Yours, that sold, let's hold on for this, folks, 3.5 million copies, which is just amazing. Okay, so I had the pleasure of talking to her or hearing her talk about Shelterwood at a presentation, a library presentation a couple of weeks ago. And I was immediately drawn to learn more, and learn more would start with reading the book. So we haven't done our review on Book Reporter yet. So I'm going to read the Publisher's Weekly starred review. Wingate's stellar latest explores a centuries-long legacy of missing child cases. Her portrayal of the region's history, culture, and landscape enthralls. Wingate is at the top of her game, and I completely agree. And on that note, welcome, Lisa. So nice to have you here.
Oh, so good to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with you giving us a quick overview of Shelterwood, like your elevator pitch of what Shelterwood is.
So the elevator pitch of what Shelterwood is. Shelterwood is the story of turn of the century Oklahoma, two little girls who have to flee a dangerous home, and the national park ranger who rediscovers their story about 81 years later, and rediscovers some very hidden history as to what was going on in that home and why the little girls had to go on the run.
Yeah, what they fled. And I find these children to be so plucky and able to figure things out. I'm thinking of the average kid today. I'm like, okay, flee your home and go. And these were skills they had to pick up along the way and learn what to do and put together a tribe of other little kids. It's really amazing. So let's go back to Oklahoma. Kate Barnard is a really interesting character, and she's a real progressive during her time. So tell us how she fits into the story besides these other two timelines.
Absolutely. So a couple little pieces of hidden history inspired Shelterwood. One was the story of little Sarah Rector, this little girl living in a ramshackle cabin with her family in the hills of Oklahoma right around the turn of the century, and getting marriage proposals from men all over the world, this little 11-year-old girl. The second was this little piece of a paragraph in a 1909 newspaper that I tripped across about a woman who heard reports of elf children living in a hollow tree in the hills of Oklahoma in 1909, and went to investigate the story, who these children were, why they were there, what was going on. That woman was Oklahoma Kate Barnard, the first woman elected to a statewide office. And she's elected at Oklahoma Statewood, get this, by the widest majority of any candidate on the ballot in a time when women cannot vote.
Wow.
Yeah. Yes. So in her purview as Commissioner of Charities and Corrections in Oklahoma in the statehood legislature, in the first legislature after statehood, in her purview are things like poorhouses, prisons, and orphanages. So she is the state's legal next friend to orphans, hence the reason she went to do this investigation of the reports of the elf children.
And had you known about these missing children cases before? I mean, you say you found this as you were doing research on something else. Was it on Before We Were Yours, or what were you doing research on? They found the story.
So I was finishing up the last of the research on the Book of Lost Friends. The last stage before the book comes out is where you panic and you check everything, in case you're wrong about something. So I was just going through doing the research checks, and I came across these two things: the story of Sarah Rector. Dug into that a little because I love a goat trail. I will follow. If it's on the frog saves woman's life or whatever, I'm gonna click and see how the frog saved the woman's life. I just can't resist it. So I started down the Sarah Rector trail, and that led to this 1909 newspaper piece about the elf children. And what those two things have in common is the discovery of oil on the land that had fallen into these children's hands when at statehood, the lands of the reservation lands of the 5 tribes are broken up. They are allotted to each man, woman, and child, parcels are, who's on the membership rolls of the tribes. And so children become landowners. They don't understand what they own. They don't know about private property rights. They're little kids, but they become legal landowners. And then oil is found under some of this land, and things go crazy. Grafters flood into the states by the hundreds and thousands, and seeking to get guardianships over landowners in the tribal nations. And the little kids are the easiest victims, and in particular, the orphans. They have no one to speak for them.
And no one to sit there and say, wait, are there papers for this land, or is it just an oral passing of the land to people? That's what I've always wondered. Like the men, women, and children each got this. Do they get a piece of paper that says this is what you own, or is it verbal?
So this is all done under the government Dawes Commission. So it's all recorded and registered. And there were some shenanigans that went on in the allotting of land too. Things like timber company owners would get 5 or 6 people together. You had to go register for your allotments. So they'd get 5 or 6 eligible members of the tribal nations together and take them down and tell them what parcels to register for. And then they'd slip a few bucks to the person doing the registering, the member of the Dawes Commission registering the allotments. And the timber person would then lease or buy. Some pieces could be bought, some couldn't. It depended on the category of the person who had the allotment. So that's long and complicated. But you'd either lease or buy that land, and then so the timber magnate who had driven, brought everybody to the registration would get this giant piece of land and cut all the timber on it, or drill the oil on it, or whatever. And so, there were things that went on pre or as the allotments are happening. And then also after, because some of the worst allotments went to some of the people who were the poorest and least sophisticated, the more traditional, didn't really know a lot about private property and taxes and all that kind of thing, because those were not very ranchable, farmable allotments. Those are the ones that turn out to have oil under them.
Yeah.
And within a few years. So everything just goes crazy. And there are all these people who who own these pieces, but they don't have that much understanding of, they're rural people. Some of them are still living a very traditional tribal life. Mm-hmm. They don't have the understanding of what's going on. And people come into the state and take advantage of this.
And it's just, like one thing after the other. So Eastern Oklahoma was the home of 5 tribes: the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. Did you study their history when you were in school growing up? Because we did the Wahani. We did the Wahani's in New Jersey.
I did. Yes, definitely. That was part of Oklahoma history. And we studied the 5 tribes, and we studied the land runs, and it was just such an everyday part of life back then. We had a lot of friends who were members of the different tribal nations, and we had some friends who, quite a few friends whose grandparents or parents still owned or lived on the original Dawes allotments, and once in a while someone would tell us a story about how the family came there. All these tribes from Mississippi, Alabama, down in there were brought over the Trail of Tears and assigned these reservation lands in Indian Territory. In the 1830s to 1860s ish, so they've been there quite a while by the turn of the century. But so sometimes people would tell us a little bit of those stories, or that they had ancestors who came over the Trail of Tears or whatever, but mostly, people just wanted to know if we thought some boy at school was cute or whatever, just the normal stuff. So it was just a very everyday part of life in Oklahoma. You didn't think much about it when I was a kid. It wasn't talked much about. It just different people were members of different tribal nations and, think too much about it.
Mhm.
And then in the 70s, laws changed and the tribal nations narrowly escaped, the 5 tribes narrowly escaped being completely disbanded by the government. And they get their sovereignty back, and they start reconstituting their tribal governments, their police forces, their law enforcement arms, their judges, all of that. And so things have changed a lot in the years since I was young, and what I knew when I was young has changed a lot. And with that has come a big resurgence of the culture of preserving the history that was kind of lost.
Right. Right. It's funny, when we were in 4th grade, everybody in the state of New Jersey studied like New Jersey, or studied, what was going on. And I feel like kids across the country go, like, oh yeah, 4th grade, you study your state and you learn all these things, but you learn what everybody tells you. You don't learn any of the secrets. And I remember it wasn't the Wahanian, it was the Lenape Indians. And we went down and we were building this wood hut. And it was the year that I started my company. And my son has never forgotten that we got an investor while I was like tying the things together. And it's like, well, how much is this? And I'm like, oh, this is like really big. And my son has never forgotten. He goes, my mom is standing building a Lenape cabin negotiating. I was like, I was going to be on that class trip no matter what. I was the working mom on the class trip. It was so funny. Absolutely so funny.
No.
But there's a lot of history that we're not really taught. Like, okay, we understood this land was taken away. We understood this, that, and now us as adults, we see what a big thing that really was. As a child, you see it one way, but now you're seeing we just took away. And what ended up happening. And the Dawes Act is something that like I wasn't super familiar with. And it's to sit there and say, okay, what was going on? You feel like sometimes when you're reading these books, what planet was I on that I missed like all this that was happening? And it's such important history. And you bring it to life in a way that, oh, wow, that is really a big thing that happened in a part of the country that I missed.
Yeah, it was had huge implications, millions of acres of implications in land that went out of tribal, ownership from people, ownership of the tribes,
Right.
went out of the hands of tribal members. And that was by design. The Dawes Act and the Curtis Act and the legislation around the turn of the century, you see, land is allotted to individual people. Rules on when it becomes alienable, meaning it can be sold. Then the rules keep changing on which groups are alienable. More groups of owners are alienable, and more groups of owners are alienable, in order for the land to be able to pass into the hands of speculators, which it does. Millions of acres are just disappear from the ownership of members of the tribal nations and are then owned by people who bought, leased, stole, or otherwise obtained ownership or control over all this land.
Yeah, marrying the 11-year-old girl. It's like we were watching Killers of Flower Moon, and as you're watching, it's like we're all wealthy, but we still are owned by these other people. We're managing the land, we're getting some money, but it's not the same thing, because somebody's always trying to marry your daughter for the land, or, oh, you died, and how did you really die? Just so that they could, get your property. I don't know. It's also
Exactly.
And also the interesting that was to me was that it was parceled out to men, women, and children, because the children are so vulnerable. And I was like, wait a second, children as well were getting property. Thinking of my sons now having property, and what you could run up against if somebody just saying, oh, I'm going to make you a deal, you'll get this.
Well, yeah, kids don't know. They do what adults tell them. And so, and if an adult comes and says, your parents died in a wagon wreck, and now I'm going to send you off to this orphanage or whatever, because there was no regulation. There's no impetus for these guardians to actually take care of these kids. So most of them send them off to orphan asylums, or sometimes just chase them off the land to survive on their own however they can. And some of them decide the children would be easier managed dead than alive, so all kinds of things happen because these are not the best kind of people who come into this business. Surprisingly, Sarah Rector, the little girl, was getting marriage proposals from everywhere, and ended up that she owned very, very wealthy oil, very, very high producing oil land.
Wow.
And she actually ended up with not dishonest guardians who looked after her. Now, she did have parents, but at the time, of course, the parents would be removed from guardianship, and a court-appointed guardian would be put in under the proviso that, well, the parents really, didn't know enough or couldn't handle it or whatever, and so they'd give them a court-appointed guardian. Fortunately, Sarah Rector's guardian appears to have been pretty above board and didn't steal all the money. He just got paid for being a guardian. But everybody has their hands in this system when you research it. I mean, the guardians themselves, the judges, the law enforcement, the county sheriffs, the merchants in town, the law firms. I mean, everybody is involved in this. Everyone's making money off it. Money is funneling to the state politicians. It's funneling to national politicians. There's so much money flowing out of this that it is almost impossible to stop. And that's why when Kate Barnard discovers the kids in the hollow tree and trips across this scandal, which has been going on in the state where she lives, but she didn't, that's the point she comes across it. And this little 5-foot-tall Irish woman, barely 30 years old, determines herself to go to war against it. And that's the beginning of Kate's war, basically, against the grafters.
And as you're reading, you're seeing children living in the tree, going to get food. They have like a whole system worked out of what they're each going to be doing, because they couldn't survive if there wasn't somebody really in charge. And you're going to go here, and we have to protect the little ones, and you're going to go bathe over here, and this is what you're going to do. And they're really, completely on their own and scared, because they're scared somebody's going to come get them. So not just living like, oh, let's go, live in the woods. It's who's going to come get us, and what are they going to do with us when they get us? Really terrifying.
Yeah, well, Oklahoma at that time is not the safest place to be. The roads are dangerous. There are highwaymen and outlaws and things that go on. The wilderness is dangerous in itself. The wilderness in itself has its own dangers, but it's a dangerous time. Oklahoma is just into statehood, and prior to statehood, Oklahoma, northeastern Oklahoma, and southeastern Oklahoma were the hideouts for all the outlaws. Bell Star, the Booley July gang, they all hid out in the Winding Stair Mountains, where this book is set, because they could run across the state line of Arkansas into Indian territory, and the tribal law enforcement really couldn't punish them. They would have to turn them over to federal marshals if they could find one. So the Rooster Cogburns, that's what True Grit is based on. Going into Indian territory, and it's very lawless, into the Winding Stair Mountains to go after an outlaw. And the real life Rooster Cogburns, there were not too many of them. That was dangerous duty.
Yeah. Sit there and say, yes, I'm going to go in and see what I can do to help. No, don't raise my hand for that one. So you've got these two time periods. You start, it's 1909 and 1990. Why those particular years? Did you sit and say, these are, worth it to set? This work is going to work.
Right. So 1909 is the year that Kate Barnard finds the kids in the tree. So hence the 1909, that is the beginning of this epic battle she starts against the graft and the whole system, this organized robbery system that's going on in Oklahoma. That's the beginning of her fight against it. 1990, the park in the story, Horse Thief Trail National Park, is fictional, but it's based on the real life Winding Stair National Recreation Area, which is one of my favorite places, and has been for years. But it was right around, it's the late 80s when it gets designated as a national recreation area. So, that's it's basically the start of Horse Thief Trail National Park mirrors the start of Winding Stair National Recreation Area in the 90s. And that's far enough along in the reconstitution of the tribes that my husband grew up down in southeastern Oklahoma. So he was my southeastern Oklahoma consultant, he and other family members on this. And some of our family members are members of the Choctaw Nation. And so it, it was an area where I had a lot of people I could consult with. But so he has really watched how much the tribes, the things have changed among the tribes. And by about 1990, you are really seeing a lot of the infrastructure has come back into play. The tribal police, the tribal courts, a whole lot of new things are growing among the tribal government. And so it's far enough along where you really see the tribal governments more as they are now and less as they were prior to 1970.
Right. So it's there's more organization to all of that that's going on as well. And then you've got this character in 1990 who I love, and she's recently widowed, and she's got this 7-year-old boy, which an age that I just adore. I mean, they're just like, where they come out with these different stories and stuff like that. What made you decide, A, she was going to be divorced and her husband had been hurt, but really on the job, and that she has this little boy?
I raised boys, so I can never resist a little boy. Wanted girls, got boys. Boys are awesome. When they're your sons and not your brothers, they're great. I had 2 older brothers. I didn't think they were so great when I was growing up, but sons are wonderful. And for her to be a single mother, I just wanted her to be struggling some with that. She sort of came onto the page fully formed, but I wanted her to be struggling with that thing that a lot of working women really struggle with, that the parenting versus work, are you doing justice to both? Can you do justice to both? And of course, as park law enforcement, Val is doing a very demanding, very dangerous job that often runs off hours, but it's also her passion, and I think so many women are caught in that struggle of you want to pursue your passion, but you also have these little people who are, have needs and need you, and you're their main person in the world. And so Val, it's just very human, I think, what she's going through. And it's very true to what female park rangers, but especially in law enforcement, go through in their jobs. It especially back then, but unfortunately still happens. Very male dominated industry, very difficult to gain respect. I had a friend who went in as a park ranger from college and only did it for about 3 years. And I still remember the letters she used to send me. And I was just so surprised at things because I was at that time in corporate America, she would say things, I'd be like, well, report them, well, do this, well, whatever, because it was different a little bit where I was working in the technology industry. It was a pretty face forward and, almost a little bit ahead of its time. And she would tell me things that you don't understand, if that will be the end of me, that will be the end of advancement for me, that they won't fire him, they'll just transfer him somewhere else. And so Val's career and her struggle for it is very true to what women were dealing with at that time.
Yeah, and it's even, she's doing math in her head about, if we eat this for dinner, this is what we can do, and you can have that toy, but if you have that toy, we can't do this. And he's deciding, I think it was a dinosaur birthday party, and she's like, oh, now how much is that going to cost? Like, what is that going to be? How do I make that dream come true? And he at the same time is grounding her in a lot of ways, because she could get super obsessed with her job. And if she didn't have him to go home to, I feel like she wouldn't have that moment to pull back and see the story a little bit differently and go back in. And also, there is a guy that she's trying to figure out whether she wants to trust again or not. So we do have that in the story, folks. We do want to see like what happens in a sequel. We do want to see it.
Right.
It was funny, years ago, people were they were writing about mysteries, and somebody says, don't let the woman have a child, because then you always have to figure out where the child is. And they said you can't go on a midnight run, because then what are you going to do? You're going to have to spend at least 4 paragraphs moving the child someplace else. And I thought it was so funny, but it's true. Are they going to go to daycare after school? What are they going to do? Who's going to watch them? And you always have the kindly neighbor who's happy at any hour of the day to take this child in. Like, That's what you have to do, folks, the kindly neighbor.
It's difficult. I actually so when the book was done, the first draft is just my messy draft. When the second draft was ready, I had a park ranger read it, Ranger Jody, and Ranger Jody Lee was amazing. And so he's he career park law enforcement, now retired. And so when he read it, I went to meet with him after he had read it, and there was this notebook full of little blue tabs sticking out of the pages, and I went, oh no. And but a lot of it was just like, yeah, that's how it really is. And this is, and one of the things he said, well, two things. You're talking about them having trouble making ends meet. On one page he wrote, yes, at one point we almost qualified for WIC. He's got a wife and two kids, and then he was talking about one of the things he did flag as wrong, or that needed to be fixed, was that Val did have Charlie in the car when she went to do a couple of fairly benign interviews in town. And Jody said, you never, ever take your kid to an interview. He said, one time, because Jody would always tell me a story to illustrate, because he's got lots of great ranger stories. And he said, one time I was in the grocery store, and he said, I had my two boys with me. And he said, I turned the corner and there was a guy I had arrested. And he said, I abandoned the buggy right there. I got the boys, and they were like, what are we doing? What are we doing? He was like, I got one by each arm, and we went right out the door and got in the truck. Wow. They didn't want that guy to see my kids or even know I had kids. And so he says, you never let someone you're handling, see your kids, even though you have a kid. You never want those two paths to cross. And so, it was a reminder how much these people who work in law enforcement of any kind, but the park law enforcement people, are actually more likely to die in the line of duty than any other, die or injured and be in the line of duty than any other branch of law enforcement anywhere, which to me was remarkable. These are very, very high demand, dangerous jobs. And they make a lot of sacrifices, just like having to abandon your groceries because you walk around the corner and see someone you've had dealings with in your job.
Right, right. And it's also, they're subject to what's going on with the land. Yesterday in Wyoming, that big road in the Tetons collapsed. And people were talking about how to get to their job on the other side now, it would be 4 hours or 6 hours each way, based on just this one. And they said, we probably will take a month to reconstruct it. And that's optimistic. And we're going to do that. And we're going into the summer season. And what's going to happen over in Jackson Hole? And it was this one moment that, I think, from reading books like yours, you sit there and you see the place and you see the people that are involved so much differently, because I'm picturing, what are you going to do now? Like, what is your life going to become? As we live very comfortable lives. We live very comfortable lives of not having to be able to live close to the things we love, as opposed to so many people who can't afford to live anywhere close to these areas. They can't, it's a whole different world of how far you commute to get to a job and be part of it.
So absolutely. It's, it's a whole different life. And I think we owe those people who do these jobs a huge debt of gratitude, because they're there because they love the land and they love the parks, but they make a lot of sacrifices also for what they do, and so do their families. And so that as we learned during the pandemic, when everybody was so glad, the national parks were flooded with people just looking for a place they could go to get away from it all. And, these people are really the guardians of that. And we're so lucky to have them, because the alternative would be that these huge chunks of land with beautiful, magnificent things on them, and some solitude and some nature and things that are very essential for us, very good for us, would belong to whoever could afford them. And their very wealthy friends would be able to go play there. But you and I, regular people, we would not have access to these places. We would never see these things. We wouldn't be able to go walk and hike in the woods, or paddle down the river or whatever, because it would belong to somebody. So, I think we're very fortunate to have these spaces, and we owe the people who take care of them a lot of respect, because it's not an easy job.
Mhm.
There's the environmental part of it, which can be difficult, the weather, the rock slides, the roads that collapse, floods, whatever, there's the bureaucratic part of it, because it's a government agency. That's not always easy.
Mhm.
There's the wildlife part of it, which can get wild.
Yeah,
And
totally.
then there's the people part of it, which can also get wild.
Mhm.
A lot, there's a statement in one of the books by rangers that, crime is or pavement is a conduit for crime. Pavement brings all the problems of the city to the country, because people think they can go there and do things and not be seen,
Mhm.
doing it. And so all of the things that exist in society find their way to the parks, and park rangers are dealing with them far, far away from any backup, far, far away from any assistance, all by themselves out in the woods.
Mhm. Yeah. And it's like you can't pull out your cell phone because it's not going to work necessarily out there. You
Mm.
pull out a radio, maybe it's going to work. You don't know. There's a beautiful and also treacherous setting in the Winding Stair Mountains. And I love this one quote that place is as special as Plymouth Rock, the Rockies, the Mississippi, and the Pacific Ocean. So I take it you spent a lot of time there and you've hiked there as well?
Oh, definitely. It's Winding Stair is one of the kind of hidden gems, I think. Still very, very unspoiled, still quite untrafficked. If you want to go somewhere and enjoy the quiet of beautiful piney mountains, it is a place to go. And we are lucky to have it. Those mountains by the night from about the 1910s through the 1930s were filled with timber companies who cut down all the timber. And by the 30s, they were so cut down and burned over that the land was basically worthless.
Wow.
And the US government bought it for something like $1.30 an acre or something, tens of thousands of acres. And, it's been reforested and it's beautiful. And it's one of those places where there are these odd rock croppings everywhere. And it's kind of like you look at clouds and see shapes, from the
Mhm.
corner of your eye, you think you're seeing a dragon or a person or whatever. And it's this beautiful area that's just very mystical and very quiet and unspoiled. And there are the remnants of what used to be there is still there. The old military road that crossed over the mountains and went from Fort Smith, Arkansas to Fort Towson was built in like 1830, and the stones are still stacked there that built up this amazing road
Wow.
that went over these mountains. I mean, there's just you can just touch history there. It's a fabulous place.
Yeah, we talk about, so much of this, and I've said, I want to go to Oklahoma. Like if I walk downstairs and say it to my husband now, he's going to go like, why did you want to go to Oklahoma? Like, do explain this to me. I said, no, Eastern Oklahoma is really where I want to go. But you brought the place so much to life on the pages that I feel like I can picture what the land would be like. And I really saw your characters. I mean, they were so well drawn, especially as these little children who are so plucky and hiding in the tree and, trying to figure out what to do to survive and who's missing. And then you also have a character which was, brilliant, that's missing in the book. It's missing in present day, this young guy. And where is he? So there's this missing in both time periods that added a lot more drama to the book as well. And as I was reading, because I was like, wait a second, what about him? We've got to go back to him now. And just as when I was ready to go back to him, you went back to him. So that was good timing.
Yeah, there
So,
are some parallels between the mystery Val is trying to solve
yeah.
in the present day with the missing teenager who's gone missing from the park, and what happened back in the day. And part of that is because um, when we forget history, history repeats itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that history in Oklahoma was absolutely buried, forgotten history. I never learned about it in school, field trips, museum trips, college. I never, ever, ever heard of Kate Barnard, much less the fight that she took on.
Mm-hmm.
But, this woman remarkably elected at statehood. I mean, who would think you'd go all the way through your history education and never hear of that in a state?
Right. And the women that she gathered with her. as you know, they take the horse, the buggy into town, and there are women who are all supporting her, but some of the women are sneaking away from their husbands to go do this because it's not what their husbands want them to be hearing. They want them to be, they're ruling the roost, and the women are all of a sudden, you can see like where we're headed in the country. It's the being on the plantation churning the butter is not what everybody wants to be doing anymore. Let's put it that way. And there are a lot of really strong opinions that are coming out. And people that were, the one character was afraid to write about it, afraid to write a story and put her name to it. Yet she feels so passionately about what's going on. And that brings us to, yeah, there was a time where women didn't have a voice. And I think all too often we forget about that.
Definitely. I mean, the whole history of the women's club movement is amazing because that's, around the turn of the century, the women's club movement is growing greatly in popularity, but it's a scandal in some areas too. The women want to go, and then there are the women who are out sweeping their porches, looking down their nose at the women headed to the women's club meeting.
Yeah.
And there's a funny quote about that that's not in the book. But well, for one thing, a lot of us probably have a mother, grandmother, great grandmother who was in the women's club movement. I mean, it was a lot of women were getting involved because they could. It was unheard of before then for women to leave the house in the middle of the day, unchaperoned by a husband or a male relative to go gather with other women and talk about things. Oh my goodness. But there's a funny quote in there about women might miss a funeral in one of the old women's club, memoirs where one of the club women was writing about women's clubs, wrote something to the effect of, women might miss a funeral or a church meeting because it was too windy or too wet or too muddy, and she'd get her dress hem muddy. But it didn't matter what was going on with the weather on Women's Club Day. Nobody missed the women's club.
Yeah. Everybody was there. This is what I'm going to do. This is what's going to happen. It's funny. We have a book club I have a book club, and they're really fun because they said this is our most fun night of the month. Like when we just come and get together, and they'll sit there and they say, "You don't know what I left to do this." I was like, and they're all much younger than me. And it's really funny. One said, I have to go to the Girl Scout meeting. And I said, well, how long is that going to take? She said, I'll be out at 8. I said, we'll be there till 9. Just come over. And it was exactly what you want to have, that kind of camaraderie. And I think these were the first times that women were being camaraderie, as opposed to like in New York where it was society or whatever. This was women pushing forward of what are we going to do for ourselves. It's not saying it wasn't happening in other places, but this is the first time it's happening in these areas of what can we do,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's the first time that women are realizing that they can have power as a collective.
Mm-hmm.
That there's power in joining together with other women. And also, I think it really is when they're finally having the chance to explore themselves. I mean, the original mission statements of the women's clubs are just, they're amazing to read. I mean, in today's language, they're very, that sounds like reading the Constitution or something.
That's very
but you can see behind it that, there was an intention for women to be able to hold their heads up and to know things and to learn things and to seek the betterment of their minds beyond just how to best iron a shirt or whatever. And, you really see with the women's club movement, women beginning to come into their own. And interestingly, 20 years ago, when I was going, my first books were coming out and I was going around speaking about them, I spoke at a lot of women's clubs in little towns around Texas and Oklahoma, in a few places further down south. They still exist. You'll still go through little towns and you'll see the 20th Century Club building or the Women's Wednesday Club building. Or the Atlanta Women's Club building or whatever. You'll still see these usually beautiful old buildings that were the club women building. They eventually got the money together or someone bequeathed a home or whatever, and it became the women's club building. And the women's clubs were still in existence, and some still are. But when I was speaking at them 20 years ago, I mean, you could tell that tradition was dying out. Because most of the members were older. They were having more and more trouble getting any younger members who were young enough to take on the real tasks of keeping things going. And even at that time, I thought, gosh, this is so sad because the stories of these women and the pictures on the walls of the years of what the women's clubs at libraries. If you have a library in your town, there's a decent chance that the club women were involved in that. We owe a lot to these women's clubs.
It's interesting to say, because what happened is women started to go out to work. And by going out to work, so we gained on one side and we lost this other thing on the other side. And women started to go to work and fight for what their rights were and to get ahead. At the same time, we lost the tradition of just what could we do together this way. Instead, it was fragmented. And I think you touch on a very interesting part of history, because it's not that long ago that you would be able to see these things, and it's just, dying out of what's going on. And yes, we don't have new members, we don't have people coming in. And it's also this thing that, and it happens generationally. You did it, so I'm not going to do it. Like, that's your thing. It's not my thing. And we lose so much by just saying that. And you could do it from everything from social media to reading books to what you eat for dinner, where you go out, or whatever. I'm not going to do what the people did before me. And tradition kind of dies. And my dad called me the other day and he says, one of my cousins was making my grandmother's sauce for, Italian sauce. And it was just like, wait a second, why have I never done that? Like, why have I never gotten the recipe? Why did I never do that? But those traditions, as much as I like to cook, I'm not going to go back and do that quite the same way. I say, let's make pasta. My husband goes, oh my gosh, like, really? We're going to make a mess in the kitchen afternoon. And when we have it, it's great. But it's another one of those things that dies out. There's just not time.
I know it is. And the odd thing is, the thing that is most often said to me and for 20 years now, when I would go out and speak, is I wish we had gotten my grandmother's recipe, my grandmother's story, my great aunt's story, my father-in-law's story down. We know pieces of it. We heard it a lot of times, but now there's nobody alive still who can tell it.
Right.
And so I think that has always been one of my messages and missions is, man, turn on the recorder, turn on the video. I used to say video recorder, now your phone, and just talk and record it, because so often we just never quite get around to that. Our lives are so busy, and when the person's gone who has that knowledge, who can tell that story, the story's gone with them, and that's the saddest thing in the world.
Yeah, we had a cousin reunion, and some of my cousins were there last year. And my dad is he was the only one on that side that was able to, leave the house and things like that. And my dad is telling stories. And as a result, I got this box called Tall Tales that has questions to ask your father or your parent. My dad's 94 going on 95. So for Father's Day, we're giving him this and we're going to ask him. And I do want to record what some of his answers are, because I know how he met my mother. Like, there's certain things I do know, but then there are other things, no knowledge. And I said, I think this will be really fun, and it'll be a way to do something different on, the holiday. And then I said, could break it up, do some at Christmas, do some at Thanksgiving, but like, let's hit the questions, because we're not going to know. We're just not going to know if we don't ask.
Such a good idea. Such a good idea. And that will be such a treasure, because even if you do know it, you don't have it in that person's voice unless you save it. And having that in the future, because there are going to be generations come along who will not have the chance to hear it even one time, much less know it, but hear it even one time in that person's voice. So recording and saving those things is just, it's hard to ever make time for it. It's sometimes a little awkward to ask or to say, well, I want to do this, but it's so important.
Yeah. And it's funny because I save his voicemail messages on my phone. And I was like, at some point, I'm going to be filled with the phone messages of my father calling me to tell me something funny or interesting. I said, okay, we have to start editing these. We can't, keep them all. And I do love, and this brings me to memories. At one point, our ranger is worried that Charlie will not remember his father. And somebody says to her, Curtis says, stories turn into memories. You just have to tell them enough. And I think that's such a powerful line, because if we repeat them, and they're the true stories, they're the ones that were kind of embellished, it is keeping that person alive for everybody.
Absolutely. And it's perfectly evidenced these days, because if you think of what you or I remember from our young childhoods, there are certain things you remember. I have a 5-year-old granddaughter who will things that happened when we did when she was 3. She'll say, "Oh, I remember that. I remember when we went there and we picked up rocks or whatever we did, you know."
Yeah.
And how does she remember that in such detail? She remembers because she's watching the video on the cell phone. Of
Oh, okay.
she's seeing that story is becoming a memory because she's seeing it over and over again. That's why she remembers so much more from being 2 and 3 years old than I remember from being 2 and 3 years old.
Right.
So, things really do become a memory when you see it or hear it again and again. And perfectly evidenced by kids this age whose whole lives are on video and on
Everything.
photo are going to have things they remember. My son, who did not grow up we had video tape recorders, but you only did that for special occasions. So it was expensive,
Right.
and we had photos, but not you just take a million digital photos.
Right.
And I'll talk about where we lived when he was 2.5. And he's like, I can't remember anything about that.
Right.
So
Right.
it's going to be different for these kids.
I agree because you take a couple of pictures at a birthday party. You don't take a million. You don't, and you're never posing everybody. I mean, right now, the perfect lives that are out there are so scary because mine was nowhere near that. And sometimes you go to take a picture. First of all, I have sons like you do, and they're not cooperative, really taking pictures. Like, why do we need to do this? Why do we need to remember this moment? We're there. And the story of what's going on. Some people on Instagram, I feel like I know their children. I feel like I've seen them so much that if I go over to them, they should know me too, because of the conversations I've watched them have and the funny things I've seen them do. So,
Well, yeah, absolutely. That's so true. That's so true. We know people in a whole different way now, and they're going to know their own lives in a whole different way. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's definitely a change.
okay, so but what are we missing? What we're missing is what you went and read in the library and the research that you did. Because right now, birthday cards are like emails or notes or funny pictures. You don't have that stack of things to go through. And if you do, like I was putting some things together for my boys. Oh, I don't really care about that. Just throw it out. And I'm like, no, 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 no. You're going to want this someday. Someday you're going to look back, but everything's written down. So what am I going to do? Go find your email to find out like how you felt on a certain day of what was going on? It's just different.
It
Completely
is
different.
absolutely different, and it is much more curated now, for sure.
Yes.
I like you said, you used to take a few pictures, and I have stacks of pictures of my little skinny-legged boys in their whitey tighties and a t-shirt because we just didn't think about
Yeah.
it back then. Everything was not perfectly curated back then because you weren't going to show it to everybody. And now I look back at their little pictures of them doing something funny. Why didn't I put pajamas on my kids? But life is so there is that pressure now that to make sure it will look perfect for Facebook, and we didn't have that.
No, didn't have that every single moment. Somebody wrote one day, I'll never forget, she goes, my child was the one screaming in the hallway, just so you know. And I was like, my gosh, reality. That child actually cried and it was real. So did you feel a lot of pressure on you as a writer because of the success of Before We Were Yours? Did you feel like, okay, now I've got to do something else? And was this the first book that you came up with after that, or did you have other ideas you knocked around?
So this is actually the Book of Lost Friends followed Before We Were Yours.
Right.
Of course, that ran headlong into COVID. That was an April 7th,
Yep.
2020 book.
Yep.
And so, everything changed, and that was kind of that with that book. So this book, I think you always feel pressure when you've had a book succeed.
Mhm.
I don't know how people deal with it when their very first book is a massive success, how they deal with the syndrome of trying to match up with that for a second book. I'm 30 some odd books in, so it's a little different, but I think you always feel some pressure when something's successful to see
Mhm.
think, well, what would be as good, what would be as appealing, because there's just a little bit of magic in what makes a book work.
Mhm.
And you can't always plan that, or you can try, but some of it's just kind of a creature of the moment, everything, the stars all line up just right, and so I think you have to realize that you can do your best, and then there's a lot of it that's still out of your control.
Mhm.
And so you just do your best.
Yeah, especially these days, especially these days, because you don't know what else is going to come out at the same time, what else is going to happen in the world at the same time, everything. I also looked up what shelterwood is, and I found that shelterwood cutting removes the part of the old forest stand to allow for the natural establishment of seedlings under the cover of remaining trees. And instead of taking out a complete section of timber, you do this. Am I right on this research that I did, or am I making something up
Yes.
here?
So the shelterwood is a forestry term. It's a technical term. For when I found it, I thought this encompasses the book. This, it's about halfway through writing the book, came across that term in the congressional hearings about designating Winding Stair and why they, as a national recreation area, why they did it. Came across the term shelterwood and thought that so encompasses the story of what happens to these two little girls who flee into the forest, and Valerie's job, and just the forest and how it feels. And so that became the title of the story. And it is the word for the tall, old growth trees that shelter and protect the forest underneath. And, and hold the soil and bring up the moisture with the roots, and keep some of the wind and weather off the little saplings, and which is a perfect illustration for human communities too, and what happens when the little saplings don't have shelter wood around them. They need to protect them to let them grow and become strong. And the prescribed way of cutting to maintain the health of the forest is, yes, to go in and selectively cut so that some of the shelter wood is left to kind of hold the forest together, but the young trees are allowed to grow up too. And there's always been big debate in the timber industry, because of course it's cheaper and easier to just cut everything down.
Right.
We used to see that when my husband and I married in the 80s, and we would go down to southeastern Oklahoma to his relatives. We would pass these on the interstate, and you'd look out at these just acres and acres and acres and acres and acres of mountains just laid bare. Soil running down in rivers from the erosion, piles of branches. And I would just think, who in the world lets somebody do that to their property? And some of it was timber company owned land. But a lot of it, guess what? Guess who that belonged to? You and me. A lot of that was national forest land. And there was, as shows in the congressional hearings, some corruption going on with timber companies who were getting the licenses to just come do wholesale cutting and haul the profits out of states. The profits weren't even ending up in Oklahoma, and which is part of the reason for the for the push to designate those lands as national recreation area, thereby protect them, et cetera, et cetera. And the people fighting against it, of course, were the timber industry, who were making a lot of money cutting these lands that belong to you and me, and not in a way that would properly preserve them. And so it's important. I mean, timber can, be cut, it can be managed. The forests can be managed, but it takes a little more effort and a little more money, and there's a little less profit in it, but it's not like it's not profitable. But timber is worth a lot of money. I learned about many things, including how valuable some trees are. There are timber theft is a thing. There are people who have had like a huge black walnut tree growing in their yard of their house, and gone away and come back, and their black walnut tree is gone.
Wow.
But that black walnut tree is worth like $150,000.
Yes,
of course someone would come steal it if they could.
Yep. We had bought a little one of that. My husband bought it. I didn't even know how much it was. And the deer fed off this tree, and we couldn't move it because they said the root structure has been down there so long, you can't move it. And I was like, I guess we're just gonna have to chop it down. But it was just, every time the leaves came out, they were just like, it was the deer boutique was coming over here and hanging out, It was like, we're absolutely crazy. So when do your editor and agent see when you've written? Like you said you have that messy draft number 1. Do they see 2 or 3, or I'm done?
2 is when my agent and first readers will see it. And then I usually do editing and rewriting based on those first reads and correction and cleanup and all that. And then it will go to the editors. So the editors are version 3 in general. They're that cadre of first readers, and my agent helps a lot because before that, it's just me. And so, nobody's reading as I write or anything, because it's just, I have to push all the way through to a first draft. It's messy. I don't know. I know the 3-act structure of the story, the basic 3-act structure, but a lot of the story is going to develop from ongoing research, from getting to know the characters, and what makes them tick, and where they're going, where they need to go, and what's kind of missing in their lives. And then just some events in real life. I mean, it can be, I can be stuck and watch to figure out how something works out, and watch some guy leave his wallet accidentally at the table at a restaurant, and the waitress go chasing after him and think, oh, he leaves his wallet. That's what happens. So sometimes it's just life gives you an answer to something you're trying to work out.
Yeah. You're saying like, oh, what is this piece? Yeah. You know what I loved in the book is at the beginning of each chapter, you have a paragraph or a saying or whatever. Did you do those as you went along, or did you go back and do those? I found it.
So I gathered a lot of those as I came along, just as I went along, and put them in a document. And then when I was queuing up for version 3 to send it in, I went through my document and started to look at them. And there are so many good ones that ended up on the cutting room floor. But I was trying to look for what fits what's happening in each chapter, what kind of is a little bit of a precursor, a little bit of a hint to what's going to happen.
And it's from exactly, this is what happened back then. Like I'm telling the story from there. And the book's dedication is just so beautiful. I'm not going to read the whole thing because I would like people to be able to, have some surprise. I don't want to give everything away on the book, but it's just beautiful because I feel like you really made the people that told these stories, these people who did these things, part of your book. And I will confess that I did not read the chapter titles on every single one as I was going, but I went back and read them and then saw the way that they tied in. And I think that it'll be very interesting to hear the audio and hear how they play in those paragraphs before they go into the rest of the story, because it's going to be really important, because it was such a big part of the book, is these real moments of history that will be, part of it. So
I love all those pieces of history, but I think it also helps make the story real.
Yeah, completely. So the title Shelterwood, was that always it?
That not before I found the word, but as soon as I found the word, that was it. And I spoke the word to a few of the first readers and friends, and everybody was like, that's the title. That's got to be the title. And so it was, that was not always the title, but it became the title very quickly. And I just knew that was, I think it's a word we should just start using, in everyday life. It's such a pretty word.
Yeah, it's just really terrific. So we're speaking of the audio, you've got Christine Lakin, Dan Bittner, and Jenna Lamia narrating the audio. Have you heard it yet? Have you heard their it sounds like an ensemble cast presentation?
I have not, and I cannot wait, because of course I hear the samples when we're picking who's going to do the audio. I listen through the samples, and these people are so talented, and I cannot wait to hear what they've done with Shelterwood. I know it's going to be amazing.
Yeah. And it's, the title ties in so many different things. And as you're reading the book, I just found myself wanting to explore more. And then you did this great, and I've only got the black and white version because I printed it out like this, book club kit. It is terrific because it's got more background as well as discussion questions, and not just discussion questions. And there's a recipe, like who knew pecans were really big in Oklahoma, the things I learned. And I really highly recommend that, readers go and take advantage of taking a look at this. But you can see there's so much more of the history that you were able to, if you just put it on the page, you'd be writing a history book. And that's not what you were doing. We're telling a story in a different way. Fiction's telling.
Yeah, I love a little, after I've read a book, I'm one of those people who's looking through every last page at the end to see if there are pictures of the real people or a little more of the story. And so the book club kit was a fun chance to just put together the little bit more of the story, and a few of the players who are in the historical quotes, but not really in the story, but were part of what eventually happened. To kind of tell the rest of the story of what eventually does happen with the grafting situation, and how the women's clubs got involved and what they finally did to kind of pressure Congress into taking some action.
So, but this becomes like a novella, everybody. I mean, this is really in depth. And I was reading it this morning. I didn't read the whole thing and through, but I was like, this is going to be terrific. If you want to sit down and have a discussion, it's like the way to go to be able to really get into the story and look at a part. I mean, there are times where I feel like a book like this could be taught in school. Okay, let's just go because it's a story. And then from there to delve more deeply into it. And I feel like a lot of what we're doing with kids today, I'm one of these people who wants to revise like education of the way we're doing things and not just have them reading Dead White Men. I want them to be reading things that they're actually going to say, wait, that was a really interesting thing that went on. And I heard it in a story. And I always tell the story of there's this in geography class when I was young. There was Pedro who wore like a poncho and they ate rice. And I completely understood a Pedro and his world because of that, because every chapter in geography was a story like Pedro. And what you're doing here is you're giving us a story about Southeast Oklahoma, but what happened that was bigger than that. And we read a lot of hardcore fiction. This probably in my history book when I was growing up would have been a couple of chapters or maybe a page. It wouldn't have been a really big deal. Yet when you really get into it, you can understand so much more about the formation of the country. So there's my pitch.
Well, I will take that pitch. Absolutely. The thing about learning history as a story is that when we read fiction, I mean, the brain science shows us that our brains are lighting up in the same way as if we were experiencing those things for real. Like if they put all the diodes on your brain and measure it, your brain's doing the same sparking that it would if you were swinging on a swing or diving into a pool of water or whatever in real life. So that means you're gaining life experience when you read fiction. And so I think we take history in a different way. It's kind of like we have experienced it when we learn through story, and which is probably why every culture of every age were storytellers, right? That's how they taught their kids. That's how they brought up the next generations. That's how they taught them. And the Choctaw stories that I read are amazing. And the Choctaw, the traditional stories, myths and legends and stories, because you can see the point behind a lot of them. Yeah, the creatures that would, the white people of the water who would live under the water. And if kids went too close to the water, they might get you and take you under the water and make you one of them. Well, you don't want kids playing around the water, right? And, a lot of the stories are a way to really teach things in a way that people really internalize it.
And, even like the story of the ranger story, you're seeing a woman who's a widow and what she's going through with her child, but you're not seeing it in a story that's nonfiction of what's going on. You're seeing a real life, and it's embodied in the book as well. I don't know. I'm on this whole thing about a lot of kids are not reading these days. They're reading dragon books or whatever. Look, I had my own version of the dragon books when I got out. Look, there were a lot of date nights of reading Danielle Steele. I mean, let's go. And there were a lot of nights of doing we got this whole book, Judith McNaught. They're hidden behind the other books, but they're still downstairs. And I feel like everybody goes through that. But then to get people back to reading and to get back to reading for pleasure is something that we really need to be working on more, because it's when my son's reading list was so pathetic when he was in high school that I didn't know what they were going to do. And there was one book they were reading, and it was a book of essays. And his friend, who was very bright, was sitting next to Corey, and he goes, I'm just going to tell you, read the first 2 pages. And then he just goes on and on and on. And he goes, so you'll have it. And then we could get to the next book. And I was laughing when I heard their versions of what was going on. And then Moby Dick. And I remember hearing Ray Bradbury saying he never wanted to read the book and he was going to write the screenplay. And I said to Corey, I just want you to know that I heard Ray Bradbury. He didn't like it either. And he was like, and then I get assigned it at school. So,
oh no,
that's really, I think that, more books like this, which will, powerfully get them into reading. So do you know what's next besides touring?
What's next besides touring? Yeah, right now touring for Shelterwood. And then, when this kind of winds down, we're through this cycle of the early promotion of Shelterwood and whatnot. I'll sit down with my idea drawer. I mean, I kind of think I know what I want to write about next, but I'll sit down and kind of figure out how that would gel together. Every once in a while, there's an idea I think I want to write about, and I just can't quite
Hmm.
get it to gel.
Hmm.
And so I'll sit down with that. And if that doesn't work, then I'll be in the idea drawer. I have a drawer of scraps and ideas and little notes and things I overheard people say in restaurants and, all kinds of things that I think would make a story. So
Well, that's wonderful. And I hope you hear some great stories in restaurants along the way, or as you're checking into hotels, like wonderful things that people are saying, but that there are no missed flights. We don't want to hear that. We don't want to hear about
yeah,
many missed flights. So
definitely not so far. Fingers, knock on wood. So far it's working out all right.
fantastic. I'm so glad you're back on the road. I really am, because I think this is a story that when people hear you talk about it the way I heard you in that preview, they're going to want to sit there and read the book because there's so much in it. So congratulations to you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so much fun to talk about it. It was such a great big secret for all the years I was working on it.
Right.
So it's fun to be able to get out and talk about it.
Right. So thank you. Thank you for your time. Readers, you really do want to go out and read this book. And then you're going to want to be looking at the book club kit, not the black and white one, the beautiful one that's on the pages. Thank you so much for joining us and for your time. We really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was so good to be here with you again.
Yeah, and next time, we'll definitely plan on next time. I'm already put in my calendar. When you're ready, I'm ready. Okay.
All right. Sounds good, Carol.
And thank you, everybody else. Look forward to seeing you next time on Book Reporter Talks To.